Hello, Biology 11. We're back. Our next topic is invertebrates, animals that are spineless. They don't have a spine. All right. And despite the fact that they're spineless, they scare me. So maybe that makes me spineless, or I don't know. Anyway, same format as before. This is our online note that you download through D2L. And then I'll draw diagrams here, and any key terms, I'll put them down on the whiteboard as we've been doing in the past number of lectures. So the invertebrates, we'll start here. What is an invertebrate? Basically, an invertebrate doesn't have vertebrae. Vertebrae are the bones that make up your spinal cord, your spinal column, right? So the spinal column is a series of bones that protects your spinal cord, or your dorsal nerve cord. That's the nerve cord that extends down from your brain and runs down your back. These things don't have those vertebrae that protect that. All right, so they don't have a backbone. They don't have a vertebral column. There's a huge amount of diversity in these things. As far as animals go, there's way more of these things than there are of vertebrates, what we are. There's a number of characteristics that we're going to use to identify things. And so what we'll do is we'll go over a bunch of those before we get too deep into the actual groups. One thing I do want to note is that as we go through this, some of the slides, I'm going to take them out. I'm going to remove them. So I'll just say, look, the stuff on this slide right here, we don't have to do that. Given that it's a pandemic, we can't possibly cover every single thing. So there are going to be a few items on our PowerPoint here that, as you're following along, cross them out in your notes. You won't be responsible for them. It doesn't mean that it's not accurate, it's not true, but we just don't have the time frame available to us to cover everything. So I'll indicate those to you. All right. So let's start looking at some of the identifying characteristics before we get too deep into the groups. The first one is symmetry. And what symmetry is, it's basically how many equal pieces can that thing be cut into theoretically, right? So there are three types of symmetry: body symmetry, radial, bilateral, and asymmetrical. Bilateral, that's like us. If you took a sword and cut someone in half, right down the middle, you'd have two equal halves that look a lot like each other. One would be the mirror image of the other. Radial is like a pizza. There's a central axis, and you can cut out to the edge from that central axis, and all the pieces would look the same, right? Like a pie or a pizza. Asymmetrical, when A is in front of a word, we know that it means not. So asymmetrical are things that are not symmetrical. Now, this is relatively rare in the animal kingdom because there is a high degree of organization. So we won't see too much out there that is asymmetrical. So we go through, we can see that for radial symmetry is like this sea anemone right here. Basically, if I look at it from a top, which we're doing here, I can see that opening right here, and I can cut out and make a whole bunch of equal pieces out of that. So that is radial. We also have bilateral. Now, our example of bilateral in the PowerPoint is an elephant. I'm not quite that artist, so I'm just going to go like this and say if we cut right through the center of that, you'll end up with two of the same pieces, one being the mirror image of the other. So that's bilateral. Think of this elephant. If I came right down through the middle of it, I'd have two equal halves of elephant. And asymmetrical means not symmetrical, and so we can see our sponge here. If I were to draw a sponge, I'll try to do it, just kind of has this odd shape to it, right? How am I cutting that into two equal pieces? I'm probably not. So this is asymmetrical, meaning not symmetrical. And the sponge is a good example of that. All right? Now, the next couple of slides we're not going to be using. So this slide, characteristics, cell organization, we're not going to be using that. And the body types go with the cellular organization. So we won't be using this slide as well. One thing I do want to go into before we get into our first group, which are the poriferans, I want to go through some other terms that are going to help us. So I'll get rid of this because we are going to see them. The first two terms, aquatic versus terrestrial, and I'm spelling terrestrial wrong, so we'll fix that. All right, basically, very simply, aquatic means something lives in the water. Terrestrial means something lives on the land. All right, now within the aquatic creatures, some are marine and some are freshwater organisms. Marine is saltwater, oceans, seas, that sort of stuff. Freshwater are like your lakes, very low salt level, very low dissolved material in the water in relation to the marine ecosystems. So if you caught something in Lake Ontario, it's a freshwater fish. If you caught it in the Atlantic Ocean, it's a marine fish, right? That's important. Quite often we'll see, and we learn more about it in grade 12, why it is, but quite often we'll see that if you take a freshwater fish and put it into a saltwater tank, the fish dies. And vice versa. If you take a saltwater fish, a marine fish, and put it in a freshwater tank, it dies. It has to do with the concentration of dissolved solute in the water. We won't go any further than that, though. Another thing that we are going to see is, excuse me, whether something lives in colonies or is solitary. Colonies are large groups of organisms that live in close association with each other. Solitary means it can live on its own. It might live in a small group, but it is capable of living on its own, right? Humans are like this. We tend to live in groups with our families and stuff like that, but if we needed to, we could live on our own after a certain age. And some other terms quickly while we're going over this. Sessile versus motile. If you are sessile, you are stuck in one spot. And if you're a motile, you are able to move. So if conditions are not great where you're at, you move somewhere else. You know what? Food supply here is kind of sucky right now. I'm going to go try over there. Or my home got destroyed by a fire. Well, I'm going to go move over there into that part of the forest or that part of the mountain range, whatever it happens to be. So sessile, you're stuck in one spot. Motile means you're able to move. All right? So look for these terms as we start to go through these different groups. Now, as we go through the groups, what we want to do is we want to learn the name of the phylum. So I'll put phylum here. And as we go through the various phyla, that's plural for phylum, what we'll do is, and I'll put our first one here, I'll put the name here of the phylum, and then we'll talk about what it is, and then we're looking for one or two key characteristics that are going to help us identify that that living thing is a poriferan. Oh, if I see that, it's got to be one of these. Oh, if I see this and this, oh, it's got to be that phylum instead. So that's what we want to do. So we're looking for an understanding of the name. Then we want to have some examples. So who makes up that group? And then what's that one or two things we can look for? And if we see them, we know that they're part of that group. All right? So that's kind of the mindset I want to have going forward with the rest of the lecture. All right? So let's go forward. The poriferans, they're the sponges. All right? So poriferan are sponges. The poriferans are. They are aquatic. They live in water. And it's mainly marine. So saltwater are oceans. These are ocean creatures. They are sessile. Sessile, we just said, was stuck to the, as an adult, they're stuck to the ocean floor. And so they can't move around. How they feed themselves is through ciliated cells. So they have cells that have all these little hair-like projections, and then food will come along and get lodged in the cilia, and then they'll break it down and they'll absorb it into the cells. So as water flows through the sponge, because we know sponges are porous, they have openings all through them, some of those food particles get captured by the ciliated cells, and then those nutrients are brought into the cells. Here's our characteristic, oscula. Oscula are openings in the sponges that the water can come in. They can expel the water back out once it's been filtered, right? So they're the openings that can expel the water once everything's been filtered out of it. Sponges can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So sexual means they use sperm and egg. And so you might have one sponge anchored over here. So sponge A is anchored here on the floor, sponge B is here, and that little sperm cell is going to swim over and fertilize eggs over here. Some sponges are hermaphrodites, which means the same sponge, B in this example, would produce its own sperm cell and egg cell, and they would self-fertilize. Either way, the use of gametes, sex cells, is sexual. Another way that they reproduce is asexually through budding, right? So what budding is a smaller version of yourself grows off of you, and then eventually one day it falls off and eventually becomes an adult you, right? So that would be like you being here, and maybe off of your leg, a smaller version of you starts to grow, and then one day it pops off and becomes its own thing, right? When you think of people, that would be kind of gross and creepy, but for sponges, it's a normal thing. So we look at some poriferans here. We can see a few examples here of sponges. You can see some are round and short and stout. Others are very delicate and small, and others can be quite highly branched, right? Quite large. But you can see the openings throughout that would allow water in the tops here of these, and the tops here of those. You can see the openings that would allow water in and out. Our next group, I'll erase this. Oop. Our next group are the cnidarians. So phylum Cnidaria. It's a very poor looking R, but we'll have to live with it. Now the cnidarians include things like jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. So jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. All right. And what they show is radial symmetry. So like the pizza, you can find the central axis and cut outward. A sea anemone was our example in the PowerPoint note. They have specialized tissues, which means in a sponge, all of the cells looked exactly the same. You know, there's no different pieces. If you look at your own body or looked inside of your body, you'd see a heart. Well, that looks different than a liver. And the liver looks different than the kidneys. And the kidneys look different from the stomach and the intestines. So we're specialized. We're very highly specialized. Cnidarians have specialized parts as well. They have the tentacles, they have the heads of these things, they have the gastrovascular cavity, and they all feature different types of looking cells. We didn't see that in the sponges, so there is some specialization seen here. They're aquatic. Most of them are marine, water, salt water. They live in colonies, or they can live alone. Colonies, large groups, or they can live solitary alone. Now what they have, here's our big identifying characteristic, nematocysts. Now nematocysts, how I kind of describe those is in the game Mortal Kombat, there's a character called Scorpion. And when Scorpion almost has you beat, what he can do is he can throw this spear that has like a rope on it. And the spear goes into you, and then he drags you over, and he says, get over here, right? And then he kills you. These things have very similar sort of feature to them as Scorpion. These nematocysts, when they sense danger, when the jellyfish or the sea anemone sense danger, they shoot out these small little nematocysts, and they they spear into your side or whatever the threat is. And what some species have is a neurotoxin that breaks down the connection between your brain and your muscles. So these nematocysts have actually caused people to die. The Portuguese man-o-war is a very has a very strong toxin, and they've actually killed people. They're very large jellyfish in the Mediterranean. They go and they've killed people. They don't mean to, just swimmers have swum into a bunch of them and then they get stung, and the brain's connection to the musculature breaks down, and so they can't swim anymore. When you're in water and you don't swim, you drown, right? So that's what these do. They shoot out, they dig in, and they have the ability in some species to pump in neurotoxins into your body. They have a gastrovascular cavity, which means, if I draw a sea anemone here very quickly, it means that all of the food goes in, all of the oxygen goes in through that same opening, and all of the waste goes out, and all the carbon dioxide goes out of the same opening. So not a very cool system. You could think about it, our food going in our mouths and then waste also coming out of the same opening. I'll stop there. You can get the idea. That's what they have. Only the one opening. So everything has to go in and out through there. Thank God we don't have that. And the life cycle of these things often has two phases. You have the free-swimming Medusa stage. So if you think about a jellyfish, there's the head and you've got the tentacles. In Greek mythology, Medusa was the lady, the Gorgon, that had a head and her hair was snakes. So that's where that comes from, to represent that. So this is the Medusa stage here. And we see that in jellyfish. But there's also a polyp stage. The polyp is the one that is sessile and stuck to the ground. So our sea anemone would be an example of a polyp. And the Medusa would be here. The polyp is sessile. The Medusa is free swimming. All right. So here are some cnidarians. Here's the Portuguese man-o-war. Here you can see it's a very large jellyfish. Now, I guess when it's by itself, you can't tell how big it is, but they can grow to be quite large. Here's another sea anemone. This one happens to secrete a toxin as well. Notice the bright colors. We see that quite often in nature. If something is dangerous, it has bright colors. It's almost like a warning to other things like, look, dude, stay away. Right? You don't want to tangle with me. I don't look like much, but I can put a hurt on you very, very quick. And there's a piece of coral there, right? Now, the danger for these things that are anchored to the ocean floor is if environmental conditions change, the temperature of the water, the salt concentration, or a toxin moves in, right, from something like an oil spill or whatever, these things are stuck. And that's the danger of having part of your life cycle be sessile. You can't go anywhere. And we're seeing that with some of the coral reefs. They're bleaching now because the water is becoming too acidic because too much carbon dioxide is getting into the water. And it's turning the water acidic, and they can't go anywhere. Jellyfish could just swim away, but these can't. Our next group, I'll quickly erase this. Our next group is Platyhelminthes. Platyhelminthes. These are flatworms. Platy means flat. That's why platypus basically means flat face. So these are the flatworms. So these things are planarians, flukes, and cestodes. Cestodes are the group of Platyhelminthes that make up the tapeworms. We'll talk about those a little bit. They show bilateral symmetry. You can cut them down the middle. They have a very compressed, flattened body. They also have a gastrovascular cavity like the jellyfish and the sea anemone. Everything goes in and everything comes out the same opening. Planarians are often freshwater, and they live, but they can live on land in very humid, shaded areas where there is a lot of water around. They're active hunters for their food, these planarians. Flukes and cestodes tend to be, or they are, parasites, and they have highly developed mouth parts for attaching to the inner surfaces of your body once they get inside of you. And you think, wait a second, if this thing gets inside of me, if it goes through my digestive system, how come my stomach doesn't just break it down? quite often what they have is a very thick cuticle and outer coating that allows them to survive when they get inside of your stomach. So your stomach acid doesn't affect them, right? Flatworms reproduce sexually. Many of them are hermaphrodites. So if there's another flatworm around, they can exchange gametes, sperm and egg. Or if they're the only one inside of you, their own sperm cells will fertilize their own egg cells. And they can reproduce that way. So we can see here, there is a free living flatworm right there. Very highly colored here. Very bright colors. There is a blood fluke right there. This is a parasite. Now this is microscopic. This thing isn't like a foot long. The picture makes it look like it's larger. These are very, very small. You can see one there, colorized version. This is the scolex or head part of a tapeworm. You can see the barbed hooks on the end of it here. These barbed hooks dig into the tube that makes up your digestive system, and it allows it to grab a hold of it and stay in place. So as food in that scrapes by it, this thing doesn't get washed out of your system and you don't poop it out. It can stay in there, it can dig in with these barbed hooks. And these are the mouth or the openings that food can go inside of. There's a tapeworm there. Here we see the head part of the scolex, and then we see the different body segments. And this kind of gives you an idea of how flat their bodies really are. Our next group are the nematodes, phylum Nematoda. These are the roundworms. So, nematodes are the roundworms. They're scavengers in aquatic environments, so they wait for something else to go along and kill something, and they'll go in and feed after it. There are some that are parasitic. We use nematodes on our lawns to kill grubs. They're parasites, and they end up killing the grubs. So you can pay for parasites if you don't want dangerous chemicals sprayed on your lawn. They live inside of plants and animals when they are parasites. Don't worry about pseudocoelomates because that went back to an earlier point. But basically, they have a tube that runs through them. And it's not like the earlier gastrovascular cavities where there's one opening and everything in and everything out through the same opening. Here, there's an opening at one end and an opening at the other. And food and that, the good stuff enters one end, the waste exits out through the other end. So this is something we haven't seen before. So a tube system for digestion. These things have it. They don't have a circulatory or respiratory system. They're so thin and diffuse that they can just diffuse oxygen through their outer layer of cells, and it's enough to keep them going, energized. And most nematodes are microscopic, but some species can grow up to a meter in length. They've extracted nematodes out of different things that were parasites, and you're able to see them quite readily. They're a couple of feet long, or a meter long is 3 1/3 feet long, right? So some of them can be quite large. So this is a nematode, one of the ones I looked at in university. This is a nematode that infects the brain of moose. And what it does, it eventually kills the moose. It disorients them, and it lives in the outer surface of the brain. So the red ribbon that you see here, that red looks like a red sort of string or ribbon, that's your nematode. The white matter behind it is the brain of the moose. There's another microscopic nematode shown up close, but I like this picture because you can actually see the tube that runs through it. Now this young girl here, this is a village in India, and she got this nematode from the water supply. It was contaminated, and you can see her limbs here, especially her lower limbs, her legs. She's contracted elephantiasis. And so what we see here is a swelling of the limbs caused by this nematode. And you can just imagine that, how bad she would feel about that, right? In other areas of the world, infections like this can occur frequently simply because they're third world countries developing nations that don't have the resources and the money that we have, right? So when I get after, students for not being quiet during O Canada and respecting what Canada has to offer to people, this is one of the things that I think of is people in other nations that live with conditions like this that we would never dream of, right? Our water supplies checked quite regularly, so things like this don't have to affect us the way they affect people in other nations. Again, roundworms, they have the tube that goes through them, right? A tube system for digestion. All right. Our next phylum, Annelids. Annelida are your segmented worms. All right, so these are like the worms you go fishing with. Night crawlers are segmented worms. So you had flatworms, roundworms, and segmented worms. I know an earthworm is round, but the roundworms and nematodes are smooth. These ones have segments. Don't worry about coelomates. We didn't cover that. They have a circulatory system. Other worms didn't. They tend to be a lot larger, these things do, than the other ones. They can be hermaphrodites, which means they contain both the ability to make sperm cells and egg cells, or they can have separate sexes. Some annelids are parasites. A leech is an annelid, and it's a parasite. It's an ectoparasite, which means it attaches to the outside of the body and then bores a little hole in you and starts to drink your blood. All of the annelids require a moist environment in which to live in. Some can live in soil, while others live freely within the water. So we'll take a look here. So there's a night crawler here. I like this because you can really see the segments if you have the picture up close at home. This is a sandworm, and I don't like these things at all. These are one of the things I'm afraid of. When I was in university, I took a course in marine ecology, and so we would go and do, take surveys of beaches, go out on catamarans out in the open ocean and stuff like that, look at samples, measure different values. These things are scary as heck. I remember taking a core from a beach. So you dig down with this tube, a lot like taking an ice core, and you get the sand and you start filtering it. And you're pouring water over it. This screen, this sieving mechanism, and one of these things was in there and it was thrashing crazily and scared the bejesus out of me. So I don't like those at all. And then I thought, well, that's pretty bad. And then we got one of these. This is a clamworm. And this thing, it had to be almost, 3/4 of a foot long. It was huge, or I thought it was huge. And I remember the professor we had, Dr. Durante, she came over and, oh my God, you got a clamworm. That's awesome. And she picked it up. And I was like, oh my God, like that thing looks like an alien. And you're picking it up like it's going to kill us all. But it didn't. She had seen them before. But we had a really nice, brightly colored one like this. So she was really happy to see it. I didn't like it at all. I was like, get that thing away from me. Nightmarish creatures. Excuse me. Our next group, mollusks. Phylum Mollusca they are invertebrates and they have a shell. That's a big thing with them. Nothing else has the shell. These things do. There's 3 basic parts: the foot, the mantle, and the visceral mass. So foot, mantle, and visceral mass. That's kind of things we're going to be looking for here. The foot, used for motion like our feet. The visceral mass contains the organs, and the mantle is what makes the shell. There are 3 main categories: bivalves, which are your shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels; gastropods, which are snails and whelks. Whelks isn't basically a type of snail, very close to it; and cephalopods, which are octopi and squids. So we look here with the bivalves, clams, oysters, mussels, scallops. They're all sessile as adults. They're stuck in one spot. They have a 2-part shell. There's 2 parts, and it has a hinge. So it's kind of like this. There's two parts, and of course there's a hinge at the back, so you've got a clam like that, right? Aquatic habitat is a must. They're filter feeders. Now they can live in exposed air for a bit, but as the tide recedes, it eventually comes back over them. So they'll trap water inside them with dissolved oxygen and live while they're in the open air. That way they'll stay shut, and then when the water comes back over them in the intertidal zone, they will be able to, get fresh water in there, more water in there with oxygen in it. Gastropods are snails, slugs, and whelks. And gastropods use their foot to move around. They have these little radula, they're called. They're little stretch of tissue with spines. And what they do is they use this to scrape along and eat food. If a snail were to crawl on you, it doesn't feel slimy. It's like little prickles. And that's the radula scraping along your skin. They're not trying to eat you. They're just moving, but you feel them, the bottom of a snail. Some have a simple lung because they live outside of the water, right? So they replace their gills with lungs. And then we have the cephalopods. A cephalopod. Cephalo is head. Poda is feet. A fitting name for an octopus or a squid. It basically looks like a head with a bunch of tentacles or feet coming out of it, right? Now you're thinking, wait a second, where's the shell here? They don't have a shell. Well, not an external one like you see on the other things. Snail shell, easy to see. Clam shell, easy to see. Their shell is internal, and it's being reduced to an internal hard rod. They're marine predators. They go out and actively hunt for their food. And they actually have been shown that octopi are very, very smart problem solvers. They're very intelligent. And so they use the tentacles and the suction cups to grab onto, latch onto their prey. And they have highly developed mouth parts that the very sharp beaks almost on some of them. And they use that to basically chop up their food, cut up their food. They can use siphons, internal siphons, to suck in a bunch of water and quickly squeeze it out to propel themselves away and escape from potential predators. So we look here, there's a clam there. There's a snail, a gastropod there. There's an octopus here. Now this is the blue ring octopus. Again, in nature, when you see the bright colors, that indicates that you may not want to tangle with that particular thing. And there's a giant squid there, right? A very large giant squid. They do exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go another couple of 10 minutes here. I think we only got a couple of groups here. And then we'll call it a day. I know we're about half an hour in. So don't worry, we've only got about 10 minutes left. ECHINODERMATA. That's our next phylum. ECHINODERMATA literally means spiny skin. Echino is spiny, derma is skin. A dermatologist is a skin doctor, and your epidermis is your outer layer of skin. So what we see here are things like starfish and sea urchins. They're all marine, which means they live in the water, salt water. They have an internal skeleton inside of them, and what it does is it produces these spiny projections. Now, some starfish only have little bumps. The projections are kind of rounded and not really high. Some of them have much more pronounced spines to them, and sea urchins definitely are masters at producing these spines, and they can give you a really bad puncture wound on a foot if you're not watching where you're walking, where these things are. Calcium's plates on the outside make them very hard. Calcium's a major component of our bones, makes the bones hard. Does the same thing with the outer surface of these things, along with the spines, of course. They are not cephalized. They don't have highly developed mouth parts. And so we'll take a look at some of them. So there's some starfish there. Not every starfish has 5 arms. I just want to put this one in here just to show you. There's another one there. Now you can see this starfish just has kind of bumps. The spines are bumps, but this one, the spines are a little bit higher, a little bit more out there. And then we have a sea urchin here and another one here. And again, you can imagine stepping on one of these, it would be very, very sharp, and it would puncture your skin, leave you open for infection. Now our last group, the arthropods. This is the biggest group of all of the invertebrates. The arthropods. Arthropoda. Basically, arthro is jointed, or joints, right? Arthritis, painful inflammation of the joints. And poda is feet, or in this case, legs. They have jointed legs. Here's an arthropod here. Insects are arthropods. So these are the dominant phylum of animals on the planet. They've got more species in this phylum for animals than any other phylum of animals. They have segmented bodies, and they become very highly specialized. Right? Starfish are a little bit specialized. Some of the worms have some specialized parts. These things have highly developed, very different looking body parts. So they're the top end. Arthropods have an exoskeleton. So when you step on them, they crunch. And they have jointed legs, which you've mentioned before, right? The exoskeleton is made of a sugar molecule called chitin. Now this slide here we don't need to do. These are adaptations to having this thick, heavy shell. But again, with our reduced kind of expectations, you can read over, but we do not need to know the material of this. All right. So we look at some of the classes here. Now we've been talking about phyla the whole time, but I think there's some interesting classes here. So arachnids are spiders. So there's a black widow there. There's a tarantula. Both of those things I'm okay with never running into. Like I said, I'm scared of a lot of this stuff. Crustaceans. So there's a crab there. Crustaceans don't look all that appealing to me, but they taste very, very good. There's a lobster there, another crustacean. They have that hard shell. These are marine creatures. Insects. This is actually a mantis. But this mantis has evolved to look like the vegetation around it. So you can see the mantis here, even the rotting part of the end of this leaf, you can see that this mantis has the brown spots that mimic that. Right? It looks exactly like that. And you can see the vein pattern in leaves. They even have that on the back of their abdomen. So this is a great example of evolution, but that's an insect on top of here, a mantis, much like a praying mantis we would have. They've evolved these characteristics to hide from predators where they are at. This is a giant Japanese hornet. That is not a doctored picture. That thing is huge. Don't want to run into that ever. These have killed people because what happens is if that were to land on your hand and you smack it, it releases a chemical called a pheromone, which means danger, and all the other giant Japanese hornets and wasps, they smell that chemical and they come after whatever has it on it. And if you smack this thing on your hand and it releases it, it's now on you, and they're all going after you. And there's a giant beetle there, right? You can see the mandible, the jaw sort of this thing. Here's the head of it. You can see the very, very large insect. You can see the exoskeleton here. Beetles do have wings. They can fly. These two shells on the back, or these two back pieces, would separate, and then the wings are exposed underneath of them. Oh, okay, this one I just do not like. Chilopoda. These are centipedes. Chilopods have one pair of legs per segment. I'm not even going to use my finger here because I don't know if I'm going to go near this thing, even though I know it's a picture. Centipedes, one pair of legs per segment. And then there's another one there. This is a house centipede. We have these in Ontario. And these things are very, very fast. In Nova Scotia, we didn't have these in Cape Breton. Maybe it's because it's an island. They couldn't get over. No one would take them over in a boat. But fast little buggers. I remember I saw one in the first apartment I had. I thought, I'm going to kill you. You should be here. When I went to step on it, it kicked it into high gear and escaped. Scared me. I had to sleep that night knowing I didn't kill it. And it knows I tried to kill it. And it's probably going to try to kill me. I'm here today, so it didn't get its way. I did find it, and I did get rid of it. And here, Diplopoda. Diplopods are your millipedes. They have 2 pairs of legs for every body segment, not just one. So we can see that here. There's another one there. Some of our kilopods and diplopods, the centipedes and millipedes, have toxins. So when they bite you, they pump this toxin into you. Many are harmless, but there are some that are very, very dangerous for that reason. And they can be highly venomous. And that's it. Anyway, this refers to one of my favorite episodes of The Family Guy, hiring a giant insect to watch your kid, and he ends up liking the giant insect more. If you don't watch the show, you haven't seen it, then there's the giant insect. So this guy was one of my favorite characters. He was only on there for, I think, 1 episode, but he had an impact on me. Anyway, that's it for this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it. If there's any questions, comment in the comment section of YouTube, or go to Edsby and throw in a comment or question there, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for staying with me through the whole 40-some minutes here, 41 minutes. I appreciate it. I'll see you soon. All right, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.